The 12th task we have here under the process domain is managing the project artifacts. So, project artifacts are essential documents that capture key project information, ensuring the transparency, accountability, and knowledge retention. The PMP exam here will assess your ability to define and maintain and control the project artifacts through the project lifecycle. So expect scenarios based questions on version control, for example, or stakeholder access and continuous improvement on artifact management processes. The first point here we have to cover as part of managing the project artifacts is to determine the requirements for managing the project artifact. Again, so the project artifacts can include charters or plans or logs or registers, reports, and baselines. So the exam may test your ability, for example, to define what artifacts are needed to be managed during the risk management or the risk execution for the risk responses. So these artifacts might include the risk registers or say the contracts or the issue logs. Next, you need to understand the question is when they should be created, for example, created or archived. So for example, the project charter, when it need to be created, if you recall that we've discussed that when we initiate the project. So for example, the project charter can be created at the initiation phase. Next question we have here is to where they should be stored. For example, such as document repositories or cloud storage or whatever shared, let's say, server that your organization work with. And also who should have the access to these artifacts, ensuring the data security and stakeholder alignment. So expect some of these questions on applying the organizational policies, regulatory requirements, and PMI best practices on managing the documents effectively. The next key point here we have to cover as part of the managing the project artifacts is to validate that project information is up to date and accessible. The PMP exam will present scenarios where outdated or inaccessible artifacts cause project issues. You must ensure that the version control mechanisms are in place to prevent conflicting documents version, for example, as well as ensure a proper document repositories like having SharePoint or Confluence or PMIS or whatever software that it could accept all of these artifacts, which is used to for the easy access. Lastly, ensure that the stakeholder receives the lastest, the approved version of the project information through an appropriate communication channels. So understanding the configuration management, the document control process, and audit trails will help you to select the correct exam questions when it comes to manage the project artifacts. The last point here we have, and the third point, is to continuously assess the effectiveness of the project artifacts management. Again, we say that effective artifacts management requiring an ongoing evaluation. The PMP exam questions here may test your ability, for example, to use the lessons learned to improve the documentation processes, or test your ability to ensure how to ensure the compliance with the organizational policies, that's the standards. Finally, on how to leverage the automation tool to streamline the artifact updates and approvals. So you may need or you will be asked to identify, for example, also gaps in documentation, how to handle it, or recommend some process improvement on how to manage these artifacts or enforce the compliance with the recorded keeping policies in scenario-based questions. And my final exam tip here, as I say, that the exam questions will often integrate the artifacts management with the governance, compliance, and stakeholder communication. Be prepared for questions on ensuring the proper document storage, implementing version control, and improving the accessibility. Finally, The strong knowledge of PMIS, configuration management, and best practices for document control is essential. Task 13 under the process domain. So, to determine the appropriate project methodology or methods and practices. The PMP exam here will evaluate your ability to assess the project characteristic and recommend the most suitable methodology for the successful execution. So expect scenario-based questions where you must determine the project needs or recommend an appropriate strategies and decide on the best project management approach to achieve the objectives effectively. The first step here that you need to take to, let's say, determine the appropriate project methodology, start with assessing the project needs, complexity, and magnitude. So the exam may present scenarios requiring you to assess, for example, the size, or the scope, or the complexity of the project. So you will need to consider all of these aspects when you are assessing the project needs. First, you need to consider the stakeholder needs and expectations, the level of uncertainty and change, also the organizational constraints and resources. What else we have? We have also the risk profiles and dependencies. And the answers to these questions will reflect on understanding of how these factors influence the choice of project management methodology. For example, when we discuss about the high complex project with changing requirements might benefit from an agile approach, while a predictable, well-defined project might align with a predictive methodology. The next step we have here is to recommend the project execution strategy. And here the PMP exam may assess your ability to recommend the most, let's say, suitable execution strategy, which involves understanding, for example, also the contracting strategies, whether to go with a fixed price contract or a cost or the cost reimbursable contract or time and material contract. Also, you need to consider the financial consideration, such as the budgeting, the funding mechanism, and the cost control. Let's say that in a complex or uncertain environment, you may need choose between the traditional contracts or more flexible contracting models like agile contracts. So you, you also will need, to think on how to balance the project scope, the cost, and schedule while selecting the execution strategies that aligns with the project goals. After that, you need to recommend a project methodology or approach when we talked about the predictive, agile, and hybrid approaches. So first, you started with assessing the project needs, complexity, and then you've looked into the project execution strategy with its tracking and the financial consideration and the contracting strategies. Then now you need to recommend a project methodology. So the exam here will evaluate your ability on recommending the best or the most appropriate project management approach based on the project environment, whether it's a stable, let's say, environment versus a dynamic. Is it a predictable environment or evolving project environment? Also, you have the stakeholder engagement. So think of how will the stakeholder needs to be frequent or the frequency of updating these stakeholders, as well as the flexibility, whether your, let's say, the environment that you're working in, is it, and does it have the ability to change in the requirements? Do you need that flexibility on changing these requirements? And based on that, you can recommend. So you should understand both when to use the predictive or the traditional waterfall and agile, which is an iterative, flexible, or hybrid approaches, which is combination of predictive and agile. For example, the predictive methodology is suited for well defined projects with little to no change, while agile is ideal for the projects with frequent changes and evolving customer requirements. And a hybrid approach might be necessary for projects that have both stable and dynamic components. Finally, is by using an iterative or incremental practices throughout the project lifecycle. So the PMP exam will test your understanding on iterative and incremental practices, which involves regular reviews and adjustment through the project lifecycle. You should be familiar with the lessons learned from the previous phases or iterations and how they influence the project execution. Also, you need to consider the stakeholder engagement through the regular feedback loop, such as the reviews or the let's say the retro perspective when it comes to sprints and agile planning. Also, the risk management practices, such as identifying the risk early, adapting plans as necessary based on the project developments. And this approach, when you follow this lessons learned, stakeholder engagement, risk management practices, will ensure a continuous improvement and ability and the ability to adjust the project direction as a new information emerges, ensuring the project meets the stakeholder expectations. My final exam point here, or final exam tip here, is we say that the PMP exam integrates the decision making process for selecting methodologies with other knowledge areas such as the scope, the risk, stakeholder management, and quality. So be prepared for questions requiring you to assess the complexity of the project, recommending the right approach, and demonstrate on how to apply an iterative or incremental practices effectively.